Up in the Cascade Mountains, recovery crews moved slowly through rock and brush where helicopters had already carved the air for weeks straight. What they found was not a man standing or hiding, but pieces of clothing and bones scattered across uneven ground shaped by weather and animals. Radios stayed low. Boots stopped more than they moved, and nobody needed to say much out loud. Coordinates were logged, terrain photographed, and tags checked while everyone already understood the mountain had finished speaking. Whatever ran into this wilderness did not come back whole or explained, and this spot was never the beginning of the story. To understand how it ended here, everything has to rewind far before the woods ever mattered. Before search grids, press briefings, and nationwide headlines, Travis Caleb Decker lived inside systems that rewarded structure, repetition, and obedience. He grew up in Pewaukee, Wisconsin, a place where routines mattered more than chaos and schedules shaped everyday life. People who knew him early described someone quiet, competitive, and comfortable, following rules that stayed consistent. At Pewaukee High School, he leaned hard into athletics, playing football and wrestling, finding purpose through conditioning, discipline, and rank. Wrestling especially taught him how to endure pressure, control impulses, and push through discomfort without complaint. That early conditioning shaped how authority and order later felt familiar rather than restrictive. After high school, the military entered his life as a continuation rather than an escape, fitting neatly into the framework he already understood. In March 2013, Decker enlisted in the United States Army, choosing infantry over technical roles that required less physical strain. Infantry life offered strict hierarchy, predictable routines, and immediate accountability, which reinforced habits he already carried. Training hardened his tolerance for discomfort while rewarding compliance and endurance over emotional expression. Peers later recalled that he handled physical stress better than emotional ambiguity, though that difference did not raise alarms then. At that stage, the structure worked, and it worked well. In 2014, Decker deployed to Afghanistan with the 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team, an experience that reshaped him quietly rather than explosively. People close to him did not describe dramatic combat stories afterward, but they noticed changes in how he carried himself. Vigilance increased, emotional range narrowed, and reactions sharpened in subtle ways that stayed under the radar. These shifts did not disrupt daily function, which allowed them to pass without intervention. Habits that worked in a combat zone followed him home without adjustment. That mismatch lingered longer than anyone realized. After active duty, Decker transitioned into the Washington National Guard around 2021, maintaining a partial connection to the military structure. He relocated to Washington State, eventually settling near Wenatchee, balancing Guard obligations with civilian construction work. Construction offered physical labor and clear tasks, which filled some gaps left by full-time service. From the outside, this phase looked like stability reasserting itself. Internally, however, the scaffolding that kept him regulated was thinning. The system still held him upright, though less securely than before. Around this period, Decker married Whitney Decker and built a family that included 3 daughters over time. Fatherhood gave him a sense of responsibility that mirrored military roles, offering routine, dependence, and defined expectations. Friends described him as engaged, present at activities, and protective without appearing volatile. That image matters because it contrasts sharply with what followed later. During these years, strain existed, but it stayed buried beneath daily obligations and familiar structure. Nothing about this chapter suggested imminent danger. The shift came gradually, not through a single event, but through the slow erosion of containment. When marriage stress surfaced and separation followed in 2022, another stabilizing structure disappeared. Divorce proceedings moved forward without violence or emergency filings, reinforcing the belief that risk remained low. Court records showed no history of domestic abuse, which shaped how decisions were made later. Emotional volatility increased, though it presented as frustration rather than threat. The collapse was quiet, and that silence mattered. By late 2022 into 2023, Decker's housing situation deteriorated, pushing him into living out of his truck. To some observers, this looked like adaptability rather than instability, given his outdoor background. Camping, rotating locations, and minimizing possessions appeared functional on the surface. Each move, however, reduced oversight, routine, and accountability. Isolation deepened while social contact remained polite but shallow. The drift continued without triggering intervention. Mental health diagnoses eventually entered official records, including post-traumatic stress disorder and borderline personality disorder. These labels did not immediately change his legal standing or access to his children. They existed more as documentation than active treatment plans, partly slowed by bureaucratic delays. Decker attempted to navigate veteran services, though records show inconsistent follow-through and miscommunication. Waiting lists and administrative friction delayed meaningful care. That gap between diagnosis and treatment widened without drawing attention. As custody schedules tightened, Decker was already operating without a firm structure holding him steady. Court-ordered evaluations and anger management requirements appeared on paper, but enforcement lagged behind intention. In hearings, he framed himself as misunderstood rather than dangerous, pleading for continued involvement with his daughters. Audio recordings capture frustration and bargaining, not overt menace, which influenced judicial perception. Risk assessments leaned heavily on observable behavior rather than underlying instability. By the time headlines learned his name, the foundation had already cracked beyond repair. When Travis Decker met Whitney, the connection did not arrive wrapped in chaos or intensity, but through ordinary proximity and shared routines. They crossed paths while his military life still followed structure, and her world still moved on predictable rails. Friends from that period described the relationship as calm, even practical, shaped more by schedules than sparks. Travis showed up on time, handled responsibilities, and fit easily into the expectations people associate with stability. Whitney saw someone dependable, disciplined, and focused, traits that felt grounding rather than alarming. At that stage, nothing about the pairing hinted at future collapse. Marriage followed without drama, and family life unfolded through familiar milestones rather than grand gestures. Their first child shifted priorities quickly, introducing nights shaped by feeding schedules and mornings anchored by school preparation. Travis leaned into fatherhood with the same seriousness he applied to uniformed life, approaching it as a role with duties rather than an emotional performance. He attended activities, handled logistics, and stayed present in visible ways that reassured outsiders. To neighbors and friends, the household looked functional, even solid, with no obvious cracks. That outward normalcy would later complicate how warning signs were interpreted. As their family grew to include 3 daughters, routine became both anchor and pressure point inside the home. Days revolved around drop-offs, homework, meals, and bedtime rituals that required consistency to hold together. Travis thrived when those patterns stayed intact, relying on repetition to regulate his internal state. Whitney handled emotional labor, smoothing transitions and absorbing stress that did not always surface cleanly. The balance worked for a time, even as underlying strain accumulated quietly. From the outside, the family fit comfortably into suburban expectations. The shift began subtly, showing itself through mood changes rather than outbursts or visible conflict. Travis became more rigid around schedules, less flexible when plans shifted unexpectedly. Small disruptions triggered disproportionate irritation, which Whitney initially interpreted as stress rather than instability. Conversations grew shorter, and emotional availability narrowed even while physical presence remained. Trauma from earlier experiences did not announce itself directly, but it influenced how he reacted to uncertainty. The household adjusted around his moods without fully recognizing the cost. Publicly, Travis still appeared like an engaged father and reliable partner. He posted photos, attended events, and interacted politely with other parents. Privately, however, emotional volatility crept into everyday exchanges, altering the tone of the home. Whitney noticed increased withdrawal, moments of hyperfocus, followed by disengagement. Arguments did not explode but lingered unresolved, creating tension that never fully cleared. These fractures stayed internal, invisible to people who only saw the surface. Over time, unpredictability entered spaces that once felt safe and routine. Travis began pulling away emotionally, responding less to relational cues and more to perceived slights. Whitney described moments where he seemed present physically but distant mentally, as if processing a different reality. Sleep disruptions and mood swings became more frequent, though not yet alarming enough to involve authorities. The family adapted, normalizing behavior that felt uncomfortable but not immediately dangerous. This normalization allowed deeper issues to settle in quietly. Unresolved trauma played a role, even though it rarely took center stage in conversation. Travis did not openly process his experiences, choosing containment over reflection. That approach worked within military structure, but faltered inside domestic life. Emotional regulation depended increasingly on control rather than connection. When that control slipped, frustration surfaced in unpredictable ways. The home absorbed these shifts gradually, without a clear breaking point. The erosion accelerated when marital strain compounded existing instability. Communication faltered, trust weakened, and emotional distance widened without a single defining incident. Separation discussions unfolded slowly, driven by exhaustion rather than explosive conflict. Whitney sought stability for the children, prioritizing predictability over confrontation. Travis experienced the shift as a loss of identity and control, even while remaining outwardly composed. The separation did not feel sudden, but its impact ran deep. Divorce proceedings began through formal channels, marked by filings, schedules, and legal language rather than raised voices. Court documents replaced conversations, and structured communication took precedence over emotional negotiation. This procedural approach reduced immediate conflict, but also stripped away informal buffers that once softened tension. Travis complied outwardly, attending required meetings and adhering to initial agreements. The absence of drama reinforced the perception that the situation remained manageable. Parenting plans introduced boundaries that altered daily life in subtle but significant ways. Custody schedules formalized time with the children, replacing flexible routines with fixed windows. Travis followed these rules initially, though he expressed frustration privately. Whitney focused on maintaining consistency for the children, shielding them from adult stress as much as possible. The household shifted into parallel tracks, functioning without true cohesion. This arrangement worked administratively, though emotional strain persisted beneath the surface. Legal proceedings emphasized documentation over emotional context, shaping how concerns were evaluated. Whitney raised issues related to mental health and stability, framing them as caution rather than accusation. Courts responded by imposing requirements rather than restrictions, reflecting confidence in compliance. Travis viewed these measures as challenges to his competence rather than safeguards. That interpretation deepened resentment without triggering immediate consequences. The process moved forward methodically, detached from the emotional reality inside the family. During this phase, friends and relatives observed changes but struggled to define them clearly. Travis appeared stressed, more isolated, and less anchored than before, though still functional in conversation. Whitney carried increasing responsibility, balancing co-parenting with concern. No single moment demanded urgent intervention, allowing deterioration to continue incrementally. The system responded to what it could measure, missing what it could not quantify easily. This gap between appearance and reality widened steadily. By the time divorce was finalized, the family structure has shifted from shared life to managed separation. Routines continued, but they no longer reinforced emotional connection. Travis remained involved with his daughters, though the relationship operated within constraints rather than shared space. Whitney focused on stability, attempting to create predictability amid uncertainty. The erosion that began quietly now shapes every interaction moving forward. What followed would unfold within this altered landscape, built on paperwork rather than trust. When the family court process took over, it did not arrive with sirens or urgency, but with calendars, filings, and scheduled hearings. Each appearance added another layer of oversight, framed as an adjustment rather than a correction. Judges reviewed custody terms incrementally, weighing stability against access while leaning on documented behavior. Early rulings emphasized continuity, preserving contact while introducing guardrails meant to reduce risk. Nothing about these steps felt punitive, which shaped how everyone involved interpreted their seriousness. The system moved carefully, prioritizing measured change over abrupt restriction. Visitation limits tightened gradually, beginning with clearer schedules and defined handoff expectations. Overnight stays disappeared, replaced by time windows designed to keep movement predictable. Geographic boundaries narrowed, requiring visits to remain within the Wenatchee Valley. These shifts aimed to preserve parental connection while reducing uncertainty for the children. On paper, the structure looked responsible and balanced. In practice, each adjustment removed the flexibility that once buffered stress. Alongside visitation changes, the court ordered mental health evaluations and anger management participation. These requirements arrived as conditions rather than consequences, assuming cooperation would follow. Responsibility for arranging care fell into a gray space between Decker, legal counsel, and veteran services. Records later showed confusion about where evaluations could be obtained and who facilitated access. Appointments stalled, referrals lingered, and timelines stretched without clear ownership. The process assumed momentum that never fully materialized. During hearings, Decker addressed the court without hostility, choosing explanation over confrontation. Audio captures him pleading for continued involvement, framing himself as committed and capable. He rationalized housing instability as temporary, presenting outdoor living as manageable rather than risky. Bargaining replaced denial as he offered assurances tied to future compliance. Judges responded to tone as much as content, reading cooperation into his words. Threat assessment relied heavily on presentation, which remained controlled. The court leaned on compliance as a signal of safety, trusting that ordered steps would be completed. When deadlines slipped, consequences did not immediately follow. Extensions and reminders replaced enforcement, reflecting faith in eventual follow-through. This approach mirrored broader institutional norms, where systems expect participation rather than compel it. The gap between expectation and execution widened quietly. Each missed appointment weakened safeguards without triggering alarms. Whitney raised concerns through filings rather than confrontations, choosing documentation over emotional appeals. She described instability, inconsistent housing, and unaddressed mental health needs with careful language. Her approach aimed to protect the children while avoiding escalation. Courts acknowledged these concerns, yet balanced them against the absence of overt violence. Risk evaluation remained anchored to observable incidents rather than cumulative unease. This threshold left little room for intuition. Mental health orders became static items on a checklist rather than active interventions. Decker contacted veteran resources, though guidance proved inconsistent and slow. Miscommunication around eligibility and services stalled progress further. Without centralized coordination, responsibility diffused across agencies. Each office handled its piece, assuming others covered the rest. The system functioned, though not in a way that closed gaps. As months passed, hearings repeated similar patterns with incremental modifications. Judges revisited compliance, noted partial efforts, and reiterated expectations. Decker continued presenting himself as cooperative, emphasizing intent over completion. His demeanor stayed measured, avoiding language that would prompt immediate concern. This consistency reinforced institutional confidence, even as underlying instability persisted. The process rewarded tone, not outcomes. Legal thresholds shaped every decision, requiring evidence of imminent harm to justify severe restriction. Without direct threats or violent acts, options remain limited. Courts operate within defined boundaries, constrained by due process and parental rights. These safeguards protect many families, though they can delay response in ambiguous cases. The distinction between potential risk and proven danger remains central. That line favored patience over preemption. Human intuition, however, does not always align with legal standards. Observers sense deterioration through patterns rather than incidents. Whitney's concern grew from accumulation, not singular events. Friends noticed isolation and rigidity, though nothing actionable surfaced. Institutions require clarity where life often offers only gradients. This mismatch created tension between what felt wrong and what could be acted upon. Communication between systems lacked urgency and cohesion. Family court, veteran services, and local agencies operated in parallel rather than in coordination. Information traveled slowly, filtered through formal channels. No single authority owned the full picture. This fragmentation diluted accountability while preserving procedure. Everyone did their part, though no one stitched the parts together. When compliance stalled, the response remained procedural rather than corrective. Letters went out, dates reset, and requirements reiterated. The assumption held that progress would resume once barriers were cleared. Meanwhile, housing instability worsened, increasing isolation. Each delay allowed conditions to normalize further. The system adjusted around noncompliance instead of confronting it. Decker's interactions with the court reflected frustration framed as misunderstanding. He positioned obstacles as logistical rather than behavioral. Judges acknowledged challenges, extending timelines accordingly. This flexibility aimed to encourage participation without provoking withdrawal. Yet flexibility also reduced urgency. The balance tipped toward accommodation. Visitation continued under restrictions, reinforcing the belief that safeguards worked. Exchanges occurred without incident, reinforcing confidence in the arrangement. Stability during handoffs masked instability elsewhere. Courts focus on moments they can observe. What happens between those moments remains harder to assess. Over time, the process created a false sense of containment. Paperwork suggested control, though reality remained fluid. The children moved within safe windows, yet the adult world around them grew more fragile. Institutions rely on structure to signal safety. When structure exists on paper, risk feels managed. The tension between legal sufficiency and human perception sharpened quietly. Nothing compelled emergency action, though concern never disappeared. The system functioned as designed, emphasizing rights, process, and measured response. That design assumes time allows correction. In this case, time allowed deterioration. By the final hearings, before the disappearance, the framework remained intact, though strained. Requirements stood, visitation limits held, and expectations remained stated. Decker expressed a continued desire to comply, framing obstacles as temporary. Courts accepted these representations within established norms. The system watched him unravel slowly, without language to name it as such. By the time Travis Decker started living full-time out of his truck, the shift did not feel dramatic to people around him, even though it marked a deeper turn inward. The vehicle became more than transportation, turning into storage, shelter, and boundary all at once. He rotated between campgrounds near Leavenworth, pullouts along forest roads, and occasional nights near armories tied to his guard status. Each stop came with just enough familiarity to avoid panic, but never enough permanence to create roots. This pattern gave him the illusion of control while quietly stripping away accountability. What looked like adaptability on the surface was actually isolation taking shape. His background made this lifestyle appear intentional rather than desperate. Years of outdoor exposure and military routines taught him how to sleep anywhere, eat minimally, and move without drawing attention. Friends framed his situation as temporary roughing it, not homelessness in the traditional sense. Travis leaned into that framing, presenting his situation as a choice rather than a necessity. He talked about freedom, mobility, and simplicity, language that softened concern. That framing mattered since it delayed intervention and normalized what should have raised alarms. Survival habits replaced domestic routines without resistance. Instead of kitchens and bedrooms, he relied on coolers, storage bins, and sleeping bags. Days revolved around fuel levels, parking spots, and access to restrooms rather than work schedules or family meals. This shift narrowed his focus, training attention on logistics rather than relationships. The world shrank to what could fit inside the truck and what lay just beyond the windshield. That narrowing reduced emotional complexity while reinforcing a sense of independence. Movement became central to how he regulated himself. Staying in one place too long increased agitation, while driving created calm. Roads offered direction without confrontation, allowing him to avoid unresolved conversations. Campsites provided quiet without expectation, though never for long. Each relocation reset anxiety temporarily. reinforcing the habit. This cycle replaced reflection with motion, creating momentum without destination. Over time, stillness felt threatening. Language around autonomy grew sharper during this phase. Travis spoke about being boxed in, restricted, and watched even when no one actively monitored him. He framed court orders as obstacles rather than safeguards, interpreting them through a lens of control. Escape language entered casual conversations, referencing fresh starts and going off grid. These statements lacked concrete plans, remaining abstract enough to avoid challenge. Ambiguity protected him from scrutiny while signaling internal drift. Internet searches mirrored this mental state, revealing curiosity without commitment. He looked up information about moving to Canada, relocating across borders, and finding work abroad. These searches appeared alongside practical queries about campgrounds, trails, and seasonal conditions. None of it formed a coherent plan, yet the pattern showed orientation toward exit. Digital footprints reflected imagination rather than execution. Even so, they hinted at a mind is rehearsing departure. Conversation with friends and relatives shifted tone during this period. Travis remained polite, though engagement felt thinner and more guarded. He avoided discussing long-term goals, steering the dialogue toward logistics or grievances. When concerns surfaced, he deflected with humor or reassurance. Loved ones sensed change, yet lacked leverage to intervene. Without an overt crisis, advice stayed soft and optional. Family members noted increased rigidity and suspicion, though they struggled to articulate specifics. He appeared less flexible, more focused on perceived injustices. Attempts to suggest counseling or housing support met resistance, framed as independence. Offers of help went unused, not rejected outright, but postponed indefinitely. This pattern preserved autonomy while rejecting stability. Each delay deepened isolation. Psychologically, the narrowing intensified as options disappeared. Living out of a vehicle removed everyday social cues that regulate behavior. Without coworkers, neighbors, or shared spaces, feedback loops are weakened. Thoughts circled unchecked, reinforced by solitude. The absence of contradiction allowed grievances to harden. Isolation did not create instability alone, but it amplified what already existed. Survival skills, once adaptive, became coping mechanisms that masked distress. Being able to endure discomfort reduced the urgency to seek support. Knowing how to navigate terrain encouraged avoidance rather than problem solving. Skills that once ensured safety now insulated him from intervention. This inversion mattered, since capability replaced connection. Competence became a barrier rather than a bridge. At armories where he occasionally parked, interactions remained superficial. Guard status provided limited access without deep oversight. He blended into the margins, visible yet not anchored. This proximity to institutional space created false reassurance. Presence did not equal engagement, though it appeared that way from a distance. The system saw him pass through, not settle. As weeks passed, psychological narrowing reached a point where alternatives felt scarce. Choices appeared binary, framed as freedom or confinement. The middle ground vanished from consideration. This mindset simplified decision-making while increasing risk. Subtlety gave way to absolutes, even when language remained calm. The internal world grew more rigid as the external one dissolved. Relatives noticed he spoke increasingly in future hypotheticals rather than present realities. Plans referenced what he might do, where he might go, or how things could change. Details stayed vague, avoiding timelines or commitments. This future orientation allowed him to endure present instability. It also signaled detachment from immediate responsibility. The present became something to escape rather than inhabit. Despite these shifts, nothing forced intervention. He did not threaten violence, commit crimes, or openly spiral. His behavior stayed within legal bounds, even as it drifted socially. Friends worried quietly, sharing concerns among themselves without consensus. Without authority or urgency, their influence remained limited. Concern hovered without action. By the end of this phase, Travis existed in a liminal space between systems. He was not fully supported, nor entirely disconnected. The truck carried him forward, yet nowhere specific. Plans existed only as fragments, scattered across conversations and browser history. Isolation hardened, autonomy sharpened, and options narrowed further. What followed would unfold within this constrained mental landscape, shaped by movement rather than reflection. May 30th started like any other exchange day, quiet, procedural, and stripped of emotion by repetition. Travis Decker arrived in Wenatchee on schedule, pulling up without urgency or spectacle. Whitney met him outside, and the interaction stayed polite, brief, and controlled. There were no raised voices, no visible tension, and no language that suggested danger. He spoke calmly, acknowledged the return time, and confirmed he would bring the girls back that evening. Everything about the moment felt ordinary, which later made it harder to accept what followed. The girls climbed into the truck wearing everyday clothes, carrying small items meant for a short visit. Nothing was packed for an overnight stay, reinforcing the routine nature of the handoff. Whitney watched them leave without hesitation, trusting the structure imposed by court orders. Travis did not linger, nor did he rush, moving with the same measured pace he always used. The exchange closed without loose ends or unresolved words. That normalcy anchored expectations for the hours ahead. As the afternoon moved on, Whitney went about her day assuming the visit followed its usual rhythm. She handled tasks, checked the time occasionally, and expected a return before night settled in. There were no messages from Travis, though that was not unusual during visits. Early evening approached with no cause for concern, just a familiar waiting that came with shared custody. The agreed return window still felt distant enough to allow flexibility. Nothing suggested the clock had started ticking yet. The first missed check-in did not trigger an alarm, only mild irritation. Whitney attempted a call, expecting it might go unanswered while the girls were occupied. The phone rang out without response, which still fit past patterns. She sent a brief message, assuming a delayed reply would follow. Minutes passed without acknowledgement, though that gap did not immediately feel threatening. The expectation remained that the truck would pull up shortly. As time pushed closer to the return deadline, irritation shifted toward unease. Whitney tried calling again, then once more, each attempt ending in voicemail. Text messages went unread, creating silence where confirmation usually existed. The absence felt heavier now, though still explainable through delay or distraction. She checked the clock repeatedly, recalculating patience. Concern grew quietly, fed by time rather than information. When the agreed return hour passed without contact, uncertainty hardened into fear. Whitney's thoughts shifted from inconvenience to safety, replaying the day in fragments. She considered traffic, errands, and minor mishaps, searching for benign explanations. Another call went unanswered, followed by another message left hanging. The silence felt intentional now, even if its meaning remained unclear. Anxiety settled in, heavier than before. She waited longer than she wanted to, hoping to avoid escalation. Past experience with custody exchanges encouraged restraint, since overreacting carried consequences. Still, instinct pressed harder with each passing minute. She reached out to contacts who might know Travis's whereabouts, though no one had answers. The absence stretched beyond comfort, creating urgency without clarity. At that point, hesitation gave way to action. Whitney contacted the Wenatchee Police Department later that evening, framing the situation carefully. She explained the missed return, the lack of communication, and the court-ordered schedule. Officers responded methodically, gathering details rather than sounding alarms. The case fit within custodial boundaries, limiting immediate options. Without evidence of abduction or overt threat, protocols constrained response. This distinction shaped everything that followed. Law enforcement attempted to contact Travis directly, calling his phone and checking known locations. Those efforts yielded nothing, reinforcing concern without elevating urgency. Officers documented the report, categorizing it within existing definitions. The girls were technically with a parent who had visitation rights earlier that day. That fact carried weight, even as time passed. Legal framing slowed momentum. As night deepened, Whitney's worry intensified, fueled by imagination rather than information. She replayed the exchange repeatedly, searching for missed signals. Every neutral detail now felt suspect, even though nothing concrete stood out. Sleep proved impossible, replaced by vigilance and repeated checks. She hoped for a late arrival or sudden call. Neither came. The next morning brought confirmation that something was wrong. The girls failed to appear at a planned 5K run, an event Travis had committed to attending. Friends noticed their absence and reached out, adding pressure to an already strained situation. Whitney's fear sharpened, moving from possibility to probability. She contacted authorities again, emphasizing duration and deviation from routine. The case began shifting categories. Police escalated efforts, expanding attempts to locate Travis in the truck. Patrols checked areas he frequented, including campgrounds and parking zones. Still, legal definitions continued to guide urgency. An Amber Alert was considered, then dismissed, since the criteria remained unmet. The distinction felt abstract to those waiting for answers. Process moved slower than fear. By midday, the absence had grown undeniable. Calls remained unanswered, messages unread, and sightings non-existent. Whitney communicated with investigators repeatedly, providing updates and context. Each conversation followed protocol, documenting rather than acting decisively. The gap between human urgency and institutional pace widened. Time continued moving forward without direction. Behind the scenes, officers discussed possible next steps, weighing legal thresholds against concern. Without proof of immediate danger, options stayed limited. They expanded checks, notified regional units, and gathered background information. Every step required justification rooted in statute. The system responded within its design, even as dread mounted. Whitney's focus narrowed to one objective: finding her daughters. She contacted family, friends, and anyone connected to Travis's routines. No one had heard from him, deepening his isolation. The absence of information amplified fear, leaving imagination to fill gaps. Each hour stretched longer than the last. Waiting became unbearable. By late afternoon, search efforts intensified incrementally. Law enforcement expanded the scope, checking broader areas and coordinating with other agencies. Still, the response remained measured rather than urgent. The classification of the case shaped resource deployment. This distinction frustrated those watching the clock. The girls remained missing, though the system still framed the situation cautiously. As evening approached again, The weight of time pressed harder. The day that began as routine now felt endless. Whitney oscillated between hope and dread, clinging to the possibility of explanation. Each phone buzz raised expectation, then disappointment. The silence persisted, loud and absolute. The clock had not stopped. By the end of that day, normalcy had evaporated entirely. What began as a standard custody exchange transformed into a crisis defined by absence. The shift happened gradually, driven by missed moments rather than dramatic acts. Legal definitions continued guiding response, even as fear escalated. The clock kept running, marking every unanswered minute. Everything that followed would unfold from this day, shaped by the slow realization that routine had failed. The break in the case did not come from a confession, a tipster, or sudden clarity, but from a parked truck sitting where it did not belong. On June 2nd, deputies located Travis Decker's white GMC Sierra near Rock Island Campground, tucked along Icicle Creek outside Leavenworth. The truck was not hidden, nor was it staged theatrically, just sitting there with the quiet confidence of someone who had stopped moving. Its placement suggested familiarity with the area rather than panic. Investigators immediately understood that this was no longer a routine welfare check. From that moment, the tone shifted, even before words caught up. The vehicle itself told the first part of the story without saying much. Doors were unlocked, personal items remained inside, and there was no sign of forced entry or struggle around the truck. Camping supplies, clothing, and everyday objects sat where they had been left, creating the impression of interrupted normalcy. Deputies noted plastic bags and zip ties scattered nearby, details that carried weight even before context formed. Nothing appeared ransacked and nothing suggested haste. The stillness felt deliberate, which raised questions nobody wanted to answer yet. As officers expanded their search perimeter, attention moved away from the truck toward the surrounding campsite. Footpaths, brush lines, and nearby clearings were examined carefully. The area looked used but not chaotic, showing signs of recent activity without disorder. Investigators worked methodically, documenting each item before moving further. Radios stayed quiet, and voices remained controlled. Everyone sensed escalation, though protocol demanded restraint. The tent came into view next, positioned close enough to the truck to connect the scene logically. Its presence confirmed overnight use, contradicting expectations tied to a short visit. Deputies approached with caution, following procedure shaped by experience rather than assumption. What they found inside shifted the investigation irrevocably. The children were there, their bodies discovered within the tent. From that point forward, the case ceased being about delay or misunderstanding. Descriptions and reports stayed clinical, avoiding language that amplified harm. Investigators focused on observable facts, noting positions, conditions, and materials without embellishment. Plastic bags had been placed over the children's heads, and zip ties were present. These details were recorded precisely, as evidence rather than narrative. There were no visible signs of gunshot wounds or blunt force trauma. The method pointed toward suffocation, though confirmation would come later through medical examination. Objects surrounding the tent carried as much significance as what lay inside. Plastic bags similar to those found on the children were scattered around the area. Zip ties lay nearby, matching those used. Bloodied handprints appeared on the truck's tailgate, indicating adult involvement without identifying the manner yet. Each item added weight to the scene, building a picture through accumulation rather than inference. Investigators cataloged everything, aware that small details would later shape conclusions. The shift from missing persons to homicide happened quietly, without public announcement or dramatic declaration. Deputies on scene understood immediately what this meant, even as official classifications lagged. Procedures changed, drawing in specialized units and forensic teams. The area was secured, access restricted, and documentation intensified. Every step followed training, though the emotional gravity remained heavy. This was no longer a search, but an investigation. Medical examiners were notified, though preliminary assessments already suggested a cause. The absence of external injuries shifted focus toward asphyxiation. Plastic bags and zip ties framed early hypotheses even before autopsy results. Investigators avoided speculation, grounding conclusions in physical evidence. The children's clothing matched what they wore during the custody exchange, narrowing the timeline. This detail mattered, anchoring events closer to the previous day. DNA collection began alongside photographic documentation. Samples were taken from bags, ties, and surfaces, including the truck. Blood samples were analyzed to determine origin, distinguishing human from non-human. Early lab results would later confirm that the male DNA present belonged to Travis Decker. At the scene, however, investigators operated without that confirmation. They treated the site as singular, assuming no additional suspects unless evidence suggested otherwise. The dog found near the campsite added another layer without providing clarity. Alive and unharmed, it suggested the scene unfolded without external disruption. The animal was secured and removed, preserving the area. Its presence reinforced the sense that the environment itself did not intervene. Everything pointed inward, toward the individual already associated with the truck. The wilderness had not interrupted events, only concealed them. As information filtered back to command, leadership faced the challenge of managing communication. Public language lagged behind internal understanding, constrained by verification and procedure. Officials avoided naming charges immediately, choosing accuracy over speed. Families and media waited for updates, unaware of the full scope. This gap between knowledge and disclosure widened the tension. Silence carried weight, even when intentional. Investigators reconstructed movements using available data, mapping likely paths between the truck and the tent. Footprints, disturbed ground, and object placement helped establish the sequence. The proximity of the tent to the vehicle suggested deliberate setup rather than improvisation. This observation shaped theories about planning and timing. Still, conclusions remained internal, pending corroboration. Discipline guided restraint. The discovery reframed every prior action, including delays and definitions that shaped early response. What once looked like procedural caution now appeared insufficient. Yet investigators focused forward, prioritizing evidence integrity over retrospective judgment. They understood scrutiny will come later. For now, the task was clarity. Every object became part of that pursuit. As the scene closed and transport preparations began, the emotional weight intensified quietly. Personnel on site processed the shift internally, relying on professionalism to maintain focus. Conversations stayed factual, avoiding commentary. The children were handled with care, dignity preserved through protocol. Even in silence, the gravity was unmistakable. The case had crossed an irreversible threshold. Back at command centers, missing persons reports were updated and homicide units formally engaged. The language in the documentation changed, though public statements remained cautious. Investigators prepared warrants, subpoenas, and broader search plans. Attention turned toward locating Travis Decker, now the sole focus. Evidence from the campground pointed squarely in his direction. The wilderness beyond became the next arena. Public understanding lagged behind internal certainty, creating confusion and speculation. News outlets reported the discovery of a truck, then a campsite without full context. Officials confirmed the children were found deceased, stopping short of detailing the circumstances. This restraint aimed to protect integrity and families. Meanwhile, the investigation accelerated behind the scenes. Every hour mattered now. The campground, once a recreational space, transformed into a point of no return. What had been an absence now carried a tragic presence. Investigators left the area knowing the case had entered a different phase entirely. The missing person narrative had ended, replaced by pursuit and accountability. The shift occurred without spectacle, marked only by paperwork and procedure. From that moment, the focus turned outward, toward the wilderness that still held unanswered questions. Once the campground scene closed, attention moved outward into terrain that refused shortcuts or clean answers. The search for Travis Decker expanded quickly, pulling in Chelan County deputies, Washington State Patrol, federal partners, and specialized rescue teams. Helicopters lifted over ridgelines while ground units worked trails, creek beds, and forest roads step by step. Dogs tracked scent where possible, though weather and time complicated every pass. This was not a single grid sweep, but overlapping efforts stitched together across difficult ground. The scale grew fast, even as certainty stayed low. The landscape itself dictated the pace more than any strategy meeting. Icicle Creek cut through steep terrain filled with loose rock, thick timber, and sudden elevation changes. Snow lingered in higher areas, melting into swollen streams that erased footprints and washed away clues. Dense canopy blocked aerial visibility, forcing reliance on ground searches that moved slowly and deliberately. This environment did not reward speed or bold moves. It demanded patience, stamina, and acceptance of limits. Searchers described exhaustion rather than adrenaline as a dominant experience. Days involved climbing, scanning, and listening, often without progress. Radios crackled with updates that rarely changed the picture. Every canyon and drainage required coverage, each with equal potential to hide or mislead. The terrain punished assumptions, turning minor miscalculations into wasted hours. This reality clashed sharply with public expectations, shaped by crime television and action narratives. Public briefings reflected that tension, aiming to inform without promising outcomes. Officials spoke carefully, emphasizing effort while avoiding timelines. Statements acknowledged the difficulty of the search, noting terrain challenges and resource commitment. This restraint frustrated some observers, though it protected credibility. Overconfidence had no place in this environment. As days passed without contact, speculation filled the vacuum left by facts. Online forums lit up with theories, each more confident than the last. Some believed Decker used military training to evade detection, framing him as a survival expert moving unseen. Others imagined hidden caches, underground shelters, or assistance from unknown allies. These narratives borrowed heavily from fiction, not field reports. They thrived because uncertainty invited imagination. Canada became a recurring fixation in these discussions. Internet searches later revealed Decker had looked up information about relocating north before the incident. That detail, once public, fueled belief that he crossed borders and disappeared. Maps circulated online, tracing hypothetical routes through wilderness corridors. Commentators speculated about Pacific Crest Trail access and remote crossings. None of these ideas came with evidence, yet repetition granted them traction. Identity confusion added another layer, muddying understanding further. Social media posts misnamed Decker, conflating him with unrelated cases from other states. Some users insisted he was a different man entirely, pointing to misinformation rather than documentation. Corrections struggled to keep pace with viral claims. Each new rumor distracted them from verified updates. The story fragmented as it spread. Media pressure intensified as the search dragged on. National outlets requested interviews, updates, and exclusives, pushing for angles that sustained attention. Local authorities balanced transparency with operational integrity. They shared what they could without compromising efforts. This balance satisfied few, since audiences expected momentum. Real searches move more slowly than headlines allow. Behind the scenes, coordination continued methodically. Agencies divided responsibilities, assigning zones and rotating personnel to prevent fatigue. Command centers tracked progress, logged findings, and reassessed priorities daily. Each new tip required evaluation, often leading to dead ends. Resources shifted constantly, responding to weather and information flow. This adaptability contrasted with the static nature of public perception. False sightings became a persistent challenge. Reports poured in from hikers, campers, and motorists convinced they saw Decker. Each tip demanded verification, pulling teams into new areas. Most sightings proved mistaken, involving individuals who resembled him only vaguely. These diversions consumed time and energy. Still, investigators treated every report seriously, aware that dismissal carried risk. As the search expanded, financial costs mounted. Over time, equipment, fuel, and personnel hours accumulated rapidly. Officials acknowledged the expense while affirming commitment. Safety considerations also weighed heavily, since terrain hazards threatened searchers as much as the subject. Rock slides, hypothermia, and wildlife pose constant risks. Every decision balanced urgency against preservation of life. Public narratives often ignored these constraints, favoring dramatic interpretations. Online commentators questioned competence, suggesting missed opportunities or cover-ups. Others framed the wilderness as a chessboard, imagining tactical maneuvers where none existed. These stories gained traction through repetition rather than accuracy. The gap between perception and reality widened steadily. Law enforcement addressed speculation selectively, correcting major inaccuracies while letting minor rumors fade. Press conferences reiterated facts, clarifying what was known and unknown. Officials stressed that there was no confirmation that Decker was alive or deceased. This uncertainty frustrated audiences seeking closure, yet honesty demanded acknowledgement of limits. As weeks passed, the tone of speculation shifted subtly. Survival fantasies gave way to darker assumptions. Commentators began suggesting suicide or accidental death, citing environmental hazards. Cadaver dogs entered discussions, both online and in official planning. The idea that Decker might never be found gained acceptance. Even so, search efforts continued. Media coverage adjusted accordingly, focusing on systemic questions rather than immediate capture. Discussions turned toward mental health, custody processes, and alert protocols. The manhunt became a backdrop for broader debates. Decker himself faded into abstraction, replaced by themes and arguments. This shift reflected fatigue as much as reflection. Within search teams, morale fluctuated with progress and setbacks. Each new area cleared without result weighed heavily. Still, professionalism sustained effort, grounded in responsibility rather than hope. Teams rotated, rested, and returned to the field. The work remained demanding, though the purpose stayed clear. Finding answers mattered. regardless of outcome. The longer uncertainty persisted, the more myth filled the space left by silence. Online narratives hardened into belief systems resistant to correction. Each new theory is built on the last, drifting further from evidence. This phenomenon illustrated how absence invites invention. When facts slow, stories accelerate. By the time search strategies began shifting toward recovery rather than capture, public understanding lagged again. Many still believed Decker operated just beyond reach, slipping through nets. Investigators knew the terrain better now, having walked it repeatedly. Experience tempered expectations, replacing speculation with probability. The wilderness offered fewer hiding places than imagined. The manhunt transformed from an urgent pursuit into a prolonged examination of possibility. Uncertainty reshaped both perception and response. Myths flourished where clarity failed to arrive quickly. Meanwhile, the search pressed on, indifferent to narratives forming online. Reality moved at its own pace, resistant to dramatization. As the search stretched on without resolution, a second story began forming alongside the real one, built from fragments, assumptions, and borrowed tragedies. Online spaces filled gaps left by uncertainty, producing narratives that moved faster than verified updates. One of the first distortions involved Travis Decker's very name, which soon appeared altered, shortened, and replaced across posts. Rusty Decker started circulating as if it were an established fact, repeated enough times to feel legitimate. The change seemed minor, yet it signaled how quickly accuracy slipped once repetition took over. From there, the story drifted further from reality. The misnaming did not happen in isolation, but alongside geographic confusion that blended unrelated cases together. Social media users began linking the Washington search to familicides in Utah, despite no factual overlap. Posts referenced a Utah father who killed his family and vanished, even though no such case matched those details. These claims leaned on vague similarities rather than documentation. Each repost stripped context, merging separate events into a single imagined narrative. What emerged looked coherent online, though it lacked grounding. Step by step, the misinformation hardened. Someone mentioned Utah, another added wilderness escape, and a third attached the wrong name. Algorithms rewarded engagement, pushing dramatic claims higher than corrections. Soon, entire threads treated the Utah connection as established, despite law enforcement repeatedly denying it. The real Washington case became entangled with unrelated tragedies, including murder-suicides where the perpetrator died at the scene. Those distinctions disappeared in the churn of online storytelling. Journalists and investigators attempted to correct the record as confusion grew. Official statements clarified that Travis Decker lived in Washington, that the crime occurred near Leavenworth, and that Utah cases were unrelated. Reporters published explainers separating confirmed facts from rumors. Despite these efforts, corrections traveled more slowly than sensational claims. Many readers encountered the false version first and never saw the follow-up. Once belief set in, clarification struggled to displace it. The persistence of misinformation revealed how narrative drift damages public understanding. People began arguing over details that never existed, debating motives tied to fictional geography. This distraction pulled attention away from verified timelines and evidence. Families connected to unrelated cases found their tragedies misused for speculation. The noise complicated empathy, replacing clarity with confusion. Even well-meaning participants spread inaccuracies without realizing the harm. Law enforcement faced a difficult balance during this phase. Addressing every rumor risked amplifying it, while silence allowed distortion to grow. Agencies chose selective correction, focusing on major errors while continuing the search. Press briefings reiterated core facts, though they avoided engaging fringe theories directly. This restraint aligned with the protocol, even if it frustrated observers seeking definitive rebuttal. The truth remained steady, though surrounded by static. The Rusty Decker label persisted largely because it sounded plausible and easy to remember. Nicknames often feel authentic, especially when repeated casually. In reality, no record supported that name in connection with the Washington case. The real Travis Decker had a documented history, court filings, and a confirmed identity. The false name floated freely, detached from accountability. This detachment allowed the story to mutate without resistance. Misattribution also affected the perception of law enforcement response. Critics accused agencies of failures tied to events that never occurred in Washington. Timelines were scrambled, responsibilities misassigned, and outcomes misread. The resulting criticism targeted actions unrelated to the actual case. This misalignment undermined productive discussion about real systemic issues. The debate lost focus, drifting toward imagined mistakes. For journalists covering the case responsibly, this environment posed challenges. Reporting required constant verification amid waves of false claims. Writers clarified facts repeatedly, even as the readership fragmented. Some outlets published myth-debunking pieces, though these attracted less attention than dramatic speculation. The economics of attention favored the sensational. Accuracy struggled against velocity. Reinforcing that this case stood alone became essential. Travis Decker's actions occurred in Washington state, following a documented custody exchange and search. Utah familicides cited online involved different families, locations, and outcomes. Blending them erased specificity and accountability. Each tragedy deserved its own narrative, grounded in truth. Collapsing them into one story served no one. By separating fact from fiction, investigators and journalists sought to reclaim clarity. The real case remained grim without embellishment, needing no exaggeration to hold weight. Understanding requires patience rather than conjecture. When misinformation dominates, reality becomes harder to see. This chapter of confusion showed how quickly stories can detach from evidence, even as facts remain unchanged. As weeks passed without contact, the search began shifting quietly, not announced but felt across briefings and field plans. Command staff adjusted priorities, introducing cadaver dogs alongside tracking teams already stretched thin. This change did not mean surrender, but acknowledgement of probability growing heavier each day. Terrain, weather, and time reduced chances of survival in measurable ways. Investigators stopped framing efforts as a pursuit, choosing language that reflected recovery without declaring it outright. That restraint protected integrity while signaling reality to those paying attention. Cadaver dogs brought a different rhythm to the operation, slower and more deliberate than earlier sweeps. Handlers worked drainages, slopes, and wooded pockets repeatedly, following patterns informed by experience rather than hope. Each alert required verification, adding layers of caution and patience. These teams operated knowing success might confirm loss rather than resolve it. Emotional weight increased even as professionalism held steady. The work demanded focus without expectation of closure. Resource strain became impossible to ignore as costs accumulated steadily. Overtime hours mounted, Equipment wore down and personnel rotated to manage exhaustion. Officials tracked expenses carefully, aware that public scrutiny would follow. Still, commitment remained firm, grounded in responsibility to victims rather than optics. Safety concerns for searchers grew alongside fatigue, with hazards multiplying across unstable ground. Every decision balanced urgency against preservation of life. Public impatience contrasted sharply with investigative realism during this phase. Observers questioned pace, direction, and outcomes, expecting decisive moments that never arrived. Social media amplified frustration, framing endurance as failure. Investigators understood that wilderness searches resist deadlines and predictions. They communicated progress cautiously, explaining limitations without feeding speculation. This honesty disappointed some, though it reflected lived experience in the field. Language used by officials evolved subtly as probabilities shifted. Statements emphasized ongoing effort while acknowledging uncertainty more openly. Phrases like "no confirmation" and "continuing evaluation" replaced earlier optimism. This shift prepared the public for difficult outcomes without declaring them prematurely. Families involved received updates framed with care and respect. Acceptance grew quietly, shaped by absence rather than announcement. The growing likelihood that the wilderness had already decided the outcome settled over the operation. Search teams continued working, driven by duty rather than expectation. Each day without discovery reinforced what terrain and time suggested. The mountains offered no answers quickly, only endurance tests. Reality replaced urgency, and patience replaced pursuit. The search did not end, but its purpose changed, guided by acceptance rather than chase. The discovery came months after the campground, long after search rhythms settled into repetition and restraint. In September, searchers working remote terrain south of Leavenworth located scattered human remains spread across rough ground. The area sat far from trails, shaped by steep slopes and animal movement rather than human passage. What surfaced first did not resemble a body, but fragments that required careful confirmation. Teams slowed operations immediately, shifting from wide coverage to preservation. The mountain did not reveal everything at once, offering pieces rather than answers. Recovery unfolded cautiously, guided by forensic protocol and environmental reality. Remains appeared separated across multiple locations, suggesting movement by wildlife and exposure over time. The condition reflected months of weather, terrain, and biological activity working without interruption. This dispersion complicated reconstruction, limiting certainty around sequence and timing. Searchers documented each find precisely, aware that context mattered as much as material. The process favored accuracy over speed. The absence of certain remains shaped expectations quickly. Key skeletal components were missing, reducing the possibility of definitive conclusions. Without a complete set, medical examiners faced constraints that no expertise could overcome. Investigators acknowledged these limits internally before speaking publicly. The mountain had altered evidence beyond recovery. Acceptance followed procedure, not preference. DNA analysis became central to identification, replacing visual certainty with scientific confirmation. Samples collected from clothing and recovered material underwent testing at the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. Results confirmed the remains belonged to Travis Decker, closing questions about identity while opening others. Officials coordinated announcements carefully, prioritizing family notification before public disclosure. The confirmation ended speculation about escape while introducing finality without clarity. Closure arrived unevenly. Public statements reflected this tension, confirming identity without detailing the cause of death. Officials explained that the evidence condition prevented the determination of how Decker died. Possibilities remained, though none could be stated with confidence. This uncertainty frustrated observers seeking definitive narratives. Investigators emphasized honesty over completeness, resisting pressure to speculate. The absence of answers became part of the record. Legally, the case moved toward closure through administrative steps rather than courtroom proceedings. Warrants were withdrawn, charges dismissed due to death, and files updated accordingly. The process followed statute, even though it offered little emotional resolution. Accountability ended where jurisdiction ended. This conclusion satisfied procedural requirements without addressing broader questions. The system closed its books. Search operations formally ceased soon after confirmation, freeing resources while leaving emotional residue. Teams debriefed, documented lessons, and returned equipment. Many expressed relief mixed with exhaustion rather than triumph. The end of the effort did not feel like success, only completion. The mountain had delivered finality without explanation. Acceptance followed quietly. Media coverage adjusted again, shifting from pursuit to reflection. Headlines confirmed remains found, emphasizing closure while acknowledging uncertainty. Commentary debated implications without new facts to anchor the discussion. Interest waned as immediacy faded, though impact remained for those closest. The story moved from front pages to archives. Silence replaced speculation gradually. For investigators, the end marked a transition from action to review. Internal assessments examined decision points, coordination, and response. Officials acknowledged difficulty without assigning fault. Wilderness cases resist clean conclusions by nature. The environment dictates outcomes beyond control. This reality shaped understanding moving forward. The mountain, unchanged by attention, retained its indifference. It offered what remained and kept what it did not. Human effort met natural process without negotiation. In that exchange, resolution emerged incomplete. The case closed on paper, though the meaning stayed unsettled. Finality arrived without relief. After announcements ended and cameras moved on, Whitney Decker remained largely silent in public, choosing restraint over commentary. Her grief unfolded privately, shaped by loss that resisted explanation. She avoided spectacle, focusing on remembrance rather than argument. Statements she released emphasized her daughters as individuals, not symbols. This approach preserved dignity amid attention. Silence became an act of protection. Advocacy conversations followed, sparked by gaps exposed throughout the case. Discussions addressed mental health access, custody evaluations, and alert thresholds. Officials acknowledged challenges without promising sweeping reform. Panels convened, reports drafted, and recommendations circulated. Progress remained incremental, constrained by policy and funding. The dialogue continued without resolution. The children entered memory through descriptions of who they were before tragedy defined them. Friends and family spoke about routines, laughter, and small habits. Their identities resisted reduction to headlines or outcomes. Remembering them this way reclaimed narrative space. Humanity replaced abstraction. This choice mattered. Institutions involved recognized lessons without simplifying causes. Courts, agencies, and services examined intersections rather than assigning blame. Complex cases rarely yield single failures. Systems function within design, while exposing limitations. Acknowledgement did not equal absolution, but it opened room for reflection. Improvement remained possible, though uncertain.